Hello, everyone. As you begin to filter in, um, I'm Jeremy Beer. I'm the CEO at American Philanthropic, AmPhil. We might get to that in this talk. And we are joined today by Mike Jones, CEO of Resound, for this Scotch talk on the power of branding. So I'm just going to give this a little, I'm drawing this out slowly to give people time to come into the room. I don't know why I treat this as it's a digital room, Mike. Somehow I still visualize people like slowly entering from the hall outside as the bell rings for them to return to the conference.
They're back from recess.
I don't think that's how it actually works.
No.
I think digitally, I think people can all come in at once, but
Yeah,
I'm not much of a tech guy.
yeah. No, they're probably filtering in. That happens still, even
Not
in the
everybody
digital
gets
world.
here. Yeah, not everybody gets here exactly on time. We'll begin. I'm going to introduce Mike here in a second. Let me just point it. So this is on power branding. I just want to plug tomorrow. We have a master class on grant writing. If that is your thing, or you think it should be your thing, or somebody in your organization might benefit from that, we still have some room in that master class. Caitlin, my wonderful colleague, Caitlin Nocera, is going to put that link into the chat if she hasn't already. But that's all the advertisements we have today. Mike, I'm going to introduce you.
Sure.
I'm going to start talking. Oh, wait, before I do that, I'm drinking, it's 1 o'clock Arizona time. You're in Arizona with me. You're right here in the Valley with me. So I always have to tell people, I do not usually drink hard alcohol at 1 o'clock on a Wednesday. But I have mezcal today. It's a mezcal talk for me. What about you?
Yeah, I'm actually drinking a little Glenfiddich 21-year Grand Reserva, which has become one of my favorite scotches of all time.
And are you and I had drinks just a few weeks ago, and I don't remember, but are you a Scotch guy? Is that your...
I'm kind of an equal opportunity whiskey guy.
Okay.
So give me a good whiskey and I'll probably be pretty happy. I do enjoy a good Scotch though.
Yeah.
It's like if special occasion, got a good cigar,
Wednesday,
I'm going to probably go for the Scotch. What was that?
Wednesday at 1 o'clock.
Yeah, Wednesday. Yeah, that's a little, this is a little before my typical break out the Scotch time.
I'm glad
But for you, Jeremy, and for Scotch Talk, I got to do it.
Well, I've become, as you know, as I've told, a tequila and mezcal guy here in the Southwest. It's culturally appropriate, which is different than cultural appropriation. So yeah, I enjoy it. All right, Mike, I'm already talking to him, but let me tell you who he is. Mike is the CEO at Resound, which is a wonderful firm based here in the Valley of the Sun in Arizona. He'll tell us more about the firm. I'll tell you a little bit more about it. He and his firm at Resound have done brand work for brands you've heard of: Google, Starwood Hotels and Resorts, Shamrock Farms, and many others. Mike is an author. His book, You Are Remarkable: How to Unlock Your Authentic Brand, just came out not long ago, a few months ago. Is it longer than that?
January. So yeah, we're now at 8 months old with that book. Yeah.
And he's also he was named by the Arizona Republic as one of the state's top 35 entrepreneurs under 35. That was a little while ago.
Yeah, that one doesn't. I don't fall in that category anymore.
2 years ago, however, you were named one of the top 40 under 40 business leaders by the Phoenix Business Journal. So Mike is real. He knows what he's talking about. We've used Mike and his team at Resound actually to do some brand refresh work for AmPhil, which I might use. I might coax Mike into using as sort of an example, maybe a negative example, AmPhil in this talk. It's not been launched yet, so I'm teasing that for people. But we've really drew a lot of value out of the process, which is partly why we're here with Mike today, although we know each other through mutual friends and contacts. And he does a lot of work for nonprofits, which is why I'm really happy to have him here, because I don't think many how should I put this? Nonprofits below a certain size tend not to think very deeply or perhaps very well about their brands and about branding and what that means, what it doesn't mean, what it takes to develop a really strong brand. So maybe we'll just start there. Am I right about that? And then maybe just go ahead and segue into tell us, what are we talking about when we're talking about branding?
Yeah. No, I think you're spot on. There is an interesting, I don't know if it's a version, and I think there's some business reasons why nonprofits, especially under a certain size, kind of struggle to think and work hard at brand. You can think of like just things like there's time and budget required, right? And as a nonprofit, you're looking to eke out every last dollar to put into your programs. And a lot of times that means things like generally like marketing, and especially like something that feels kind of
Right.
like an add-on, kind of like if we could ever get there, we'll work on our brand kind of thing. It's like, yeah, that's down the road. So I think that's part of it.
Okay.
I think you also have this major challenge with a lot of nonprofits where major donors actually drive a lot of programming, or can, if
Yeah.
you kind of let them. And that can actually be counter to your brand, right? In that if I'm on a singular mission and purpose, and that is the core of my brand, right? We start talking about like what makes for a great brand, what makes for a remarkable brand. Purpose is one of the like really foundational fundamental pieces.
Mhm.
If you have people giving you lots of money and then saying, here are the strings attached to that money, you have to use it in this way, and it's maybe tangential or maybe even completely outside of kind of the focus of your purpose, you're probably still going to take the money and you're going to do it. And we've worked with nonprofits where we've seen over decades kind of that pattern, and you kind of lose the sense of like who we are, right?
Yeah.
And that's just a fundamental challenge of nonprofits. When you're taking money and there's strings attached to some of that money, and the temptation is just like, oh, well, we got to make them happy. And you can find this even in for-profit businesses, right? The example I give is you think about like a large B2B company that's selling to other businesses. Their biggest clients typically drive a lot of decision-making within that company. And you can often get off track. If you allow a large client, you allow too much of your kind of client spread. And you think about that in the space of donors, right? Your biggest donors are great. They're going to fund a lot of what you're doing, but they often also come with loud voices. And
Yeah.
so if you haven't done the hard work to really say, this is what we are doing, this is what we're focused on, this is what our brand stands for, you're going to be tempted to shift out of that and start to dilute the brand over time, or dilute whatever wasn't even there to begin with. So just going back though to your question, like what makes a brand, right? I think there's obvious elements of branding that people think of when they think of brand. They think logo, they think the name of the organization, maybe some slogan or tagline, some messaging, colors, the visual aspects of the brand and how it portrays itself with some kind of personality visually. I
Yeah.
think those are all really important aspects, but I think there are foundational elements that if you don't have them, all those other things that you can touch and see and feel really become very subjective and very kind of a facade, right? And they don't really mean much over time. And I think you have to start with things like what we said, purpose, core values. What is the culture that we're building in our organization? What are the kind of the do's and don'ts, the way we're going to do things, right? Kind of the grain of the wood, right? If you want to use a metaphor.
Right.
Every organization has a grain. And that's something I talk a lot about, and I think very highly about, is that every organization has a particular identity already, right? The question is, do you know it and do you communicate it? And that is kind of fundamental to more of a philosophical view of like, do things actually exist? Do they have a kind of epitome, kind of the Aristotelian versus Platonic ideals, right?
Yeah.
Those I think are true, right? Those are true of organizations. Organizations are real things, a group of people on a common purpose. If you want to most kind of define an organization down to its like, what is it? That has an identity. And the particular group of people is going to also influence that identity. That's where like you got to talk about culture, and you got to talk about how do we do work? How do we get things done? What are the kind of rules of the road for us in comparison to maybe others? So those are the things I say are really foundational before you get to logo, name, tagline, all that fun stuff. It's really a purpose, in nonprofits, that's mission, right? Or mission vision, or something like that, some common mission. I think a lot of nonprofits actually do a good job at thinking a lot about those things. Where I see the struggle with a lot of nonprofits is making them simple, right? It's like, I'll look at their website and it'll be like, we have a vision statement, we have a mission statement, we might even also have a purpose statement. And it's like, that's too much. Give me one statement. What makes sense in one statement as to what do we do, what are we aiming for, and how do we get people excited to come along, right? And support.
You don't need a mission statement, a vision statement, and a purpose statement.
Not externally, at least, right? Maybe there's some reasoning for that. I would even argue if you can get it all down into one. I like purpose. I like a purpose statement. For me, that just makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I'll be honest with you. I've never, even though I've argued that I do know this to clients, I cannot keep mission and vision generally really distinguishable in practice. In theory, I wanted, but in practice, it's very hard. So you're already getting me with the idea of like, just do a purpose statement.
Just do a purpose statement. Why do we exist? I mean, and that's really why what you're answering is like, why are we here today, and why are we going to be here for a long time to come? And that's again requires kind of thinking at a higher level, getting out of the programs in your organization, and saying, what is it that ties everything we do together? And that's often actually for a lot of kind of existing organizations that we work with. That's often what we're being called in to do, is help them kind of put all the pieces back together, because over time it's kind of been like, oh, well, we started doing this because this person said we could do that, and this person funded this program, so we're doing that now. And now it's like, oh, we're doing 20 different programs for a whole wide variety of different people with different needs, and they don't really make sense together. And that's a hard nut to crack and kind of untie that knot, right? And say, why do these all make sense? And sometimes the answer is
they don't.
Some of these don't.
Yeah.
And then you have to make some hard decisions about, do we cut that? Do we spin up another brand to house that because it makes more sense?
Right.
And again, I come back to that purpose, right? If it doesn't feed into the purpose really clearly, it's probably a different thing. It's not the table, it's the chair. And so let's not call it the table.
And by the way, before I go further, there are some technical difficulties. For some reason, the chat is disabled. Yeah. So here's the thing. The Q&A works because somebody came in to Q&A and told me,
there we go.
Hey man, chat doesn't work. So you can just put all your stuff in the Q&A. Caitlin is working diligently behind the scenes. Part of our brand here at Amphil is like Luddism. We're technologically, sometimes slightly technologically challenged. Certainly I am. So anyway, this is very on brand for us not to have the chat.
It is it is a bit on brand.
Anyway, so put anything in the Q&A that you want to ask, and we can deal with it there. And I do invite you, by the way, to put your questions in here. These are very casual chats that go wherever Mike, in this case, Mike and I, wherever we take them. So happy to have your questions. Put them in the Q&A if the chat's still not working. What are some of the things you see? Well, no, let me stay with the nonprofits thing. When would you say, Mike, you got a nonprofit, a lot of times people are bootstrapping these nonprofits up. When do you need to really start paying attention? This is a kind of a dumb question in a way, but like, when should you go back and look and say, what's the point? You come and say, okay, let's get serious about our brand. Let's take a step back and restate or refine our purpose and everything else that goes with it. I know I like how you've stated, like, hey, the core thing here is what's your purpose? What's your identity? What's your way? Your culture. I like that. When do you think that should happen in the life of a nonprofit?
So those fundamental elements like purpose and values, culture, I would hope that you're working on those from day zero, right? And you might not have them fully formalized, like, oh, we've got it really dialed in, we really know it, and we all believe it, and we're not going to change it. That might take a couple years. What I do see is that you're going to start with one program, right? So we're talking about kind of a business sense. As an organization, you almost always have like one program. It's like the initial program. The minute you start even thinking about a second program, I think you really need to start taking brands seriously. Okay. Because that's the minute that the organization needs to have an identity that can encapsulate multiple programs. A lot of times what happens is the first program becomes the brand. And that becomes the identity of the organization. And then when you start adding programs, it gets confused. right? Because a lot of times the identity is so specific to that particular program, whatever it is, the function of it, or who it's trying to reach, right? Who it's trying to help and serve. And that just gets really muddy really quick the minute you start adding more programs.
Yeah.
And so I would hope that you're making me thinking a little bit ahead of like, do we plan to have additional programs? Great. Then we need to have a brand with a purpose and a sense of vision to it that will be able to house these different programs and make sense of them, right? If you want to think about things in kind of a corporate sense, right? The example I often use is Nike. How many different products does Nike offer to the marketplace? I have to assume there's thousands of SKUs, right, in their catalog. And yet there's a holisticness to that set, right? It doesn't feel like there's too many products that are like way outside of what we think of as Nike, right? And one of the big things is they're not going to chase stuff that isn't athletically oriented.
Right.
And that from almost day one with Phil Knight as their founder, really thinking through like, what do we want to be long-term? It was always this sense of we want to help people achieve athletic victory. They didn't start with mass consumerism. They started with a very niche product for a niche audience, which was running shoes for professional athletes. And that's all they did for over 10 years. I think it was maybe almost 15. And it wasn't until Phil kind of said, look, we've scaled that. I've always had this vision to be something else, something bigger. But even from day one, they've always said, you know, it's Nike, right? It's victory. Greek goddess of victory is even the name. And they've never strayed from that. And I think that's allowed them to even say, what are we going to add to the mix? One of the most interesting aspects of their brand is the fact that they could go into the golf market with zero experience, zero equity in that market from a brand perspective, and within a matter of years be outselling Ping, who for decades had owned that market. And that is a testament to like what a brand can do. And if you translate that into nonprofits, it's like you want a brand that is so focused on purpose that a lot of opportunities can fit in that, right? And now it starts to make sense of all these programs that we're adding because they're actually focused on that purpose, but they're not so functionally oriented. Like your brand isn't functionally oriented.
It's such a smart point and a good point. I mean, so often here, I think there's a sort of faux sophisticated response sometimes to a nonprofit or a business or nonprofit, like you're doing too many things, or we're doing too many things. It's very likely that you're not oftentimes. I mean, sometimes you are drifting unless a donor has gotten you to do X and Y.
Yeah.
But oftentimes all these different things you're doing are serving a single purpose. You're just not articulating well the one thing you're doing, right? Which is fixing homelessness or something, you know, whatever. And so you have 12 programs, who cares, you know? You have 4, you have 12. It's all, if they all are serving this purpose, I mean, that's kind of a management decision, but it's not really it shouldn't be a brand problem if you're doing it right.
Yeah, and the communication is like so critical. And I think that's where a lot of nonprofits struggle, is just like, how do we make this make sense and put it into a singular story, right? Why is it that we're doing these programs for these people? And why is it we're talking to you to help us fund that, right? And that's the challenge of nonprofits, is that you don't have a singular audience with your story. You know, I think I love working with for-profit businesses because it's like, there's one audience, it's your set of customers, right? And maybe you can say investors are an audience and employees are an audience. Okay, we can get a little more complicated with stakeholders in that model. But when you add donors to the mix and the nonprofit mix, it's like, okay, and that really is actually your primary audience. You know, it's like you're rarely marketing to the people you serve.
Right.
That gets a little more complicated in terms of, you know, what you're trying to do. But it depends on the nonprofit.
Schools are one that comes to my mind, by the way. We often really do have a little audience than many others, I'm sure.
Yeah. And if you're a more revenue driven model, you know, I'm preemptively, I know you're going to ask me some examples of nonprofits, and I was like, oh, I got to do some more homework, because honestly, like, I'm very familiar with the ones we work with. I'm not always familiar with kind of just generally. And so I was like doing some homework, and I was like, oh my goodness, like Girl Scouts and the Y, right? These are two foundational brands in the nonprofit world but they're very consumer oriented, right? And the way that they're structured, the way they're providing services. There's a a revenue model there, and so I think there's some lessons to learn from them, but I don't know that they're translatable to every nonprofit.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know like their donor to revenue mix. Like that'd be really interesting
Yeah.
to unpack.
Yeah.
But their brands are incredible. When I think about like really strong nonprofit brands and what they're capable of, those are two that really I think stand out. And there's a couple others we'll get to later
Okay.
that have some interesting elements that I don't know that we always remember when we're thinking about brand.
Well, this question from John might be a way for you to get to some of those examples. I don't know, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it. So by the way, so far, I'm going to recap. So far, I found like purpose is the central feature of a brand. I hope I'm saying that correctly. A good brand.
Yep.
It's oriented around.
I think that's the center. It's the target.
It's a target, yeah, which is great. And then you can do a lot of things from that. John asks, hey, how about a brand that is successful and focused, but whose branding is much broader than its mission? So taking an organization with an unchanging mission, but changing its name, logo, style to refresh the brand and make it more identified with its focused mission. You ever been in a situation like that? Or what advice would you give to John?
Yeah, I mean, I think every organization goes through an evolution with their brand, right? It's not a static set it, forget it. I think there's work you can do up front to make it more that way. But I mean, every organization is going to start somewhere and it's going to grow. And there's going to be opportunities in that process to refine the brand, to maybe refresh it because maybe like the logo wasn't really ideal to start with, or the messaging needs to shift a little bit. Style can also be another issue. Like if you're very tied into a specific style from a certain era within your design of your brand and styles change, and you find that you kind of look dated, right? And it's time to refresh. There are elements, if you get really technical, you get into like graphic design strategy, right? There are ways to design brands to be timeless, right? And I can think of tons of brands who very rarely are having to change major elements of their brand over time because they went about that process the right way the first time. And just keeping things simple. That's one of the biggest things you can do in the branding process is like, how simple can we make it and still communicate what we need to communicate? There's a very famous logo designer who's no longer with us. His name is Paul Rand, not to be confused with, or sorry, Rand Paul. No, I'm always getting them mixed up.
It's Paul Rand, not Rand Paul.
Yes, there we go. It is Paul Rand. Very famous designer. He did the original like AT&T logo. There's tons of logos that you can go back and find that stood for a really long time. They stood the test of time. He has 7 principles of a great logo. But the one that he says, if you're going to like load up on all the energy and time on one, it is how simple can you make it? And the more simple you make something like a logo or a tagline or any of your other elements, the better chance you have of something that will stand the test of time rather than something you're constantly having to refresh. But the other element of that is if you think through like kind of going all the way back to what we talked about almost at the beginning, there's a particular identity that you already have in your organization. And so even as you mature, you grow, your programs change, you add things, your team grows, perhaps like your mix of donors grows, right? There's an element of like, you're still who you are. And I liken that to like a tree. So a tree, when it starts, is a seed, right? That's how it starts. And then it grows into a sapling that grows into a mature tree that eventually produces fruit, if it's a fruit tree in this example. At no point, if we're talking about an orange tree, do we find that it has an apple seed, right? It always has the identity of an orange tree, even though the manifestation of it changes over time. It grows and it matures, but it's never not an orange tree, or never not going to be an orange tree. Obviously, it's a metaphor. There's probably a little breakdown there with organizations.
Yeah, no, but
I think when your purpose changes, that is when you have a true like rebrand in the fullest sense of that word of like, we kind of have to start over.
Right.
And there's different things that can precipitate that purpose change. The biggest one being your top level leadership changes.
Yeah.
Your executive director, and maybe you have a big changeover in the board, probably going to be some soul searching in that process, and someone's going to want to change the purpose a bit. And
Yeah.
I'm going to bet it's going to lead to at least the need for a rebrand, if not actually doing it. I hope that kind of answered the question.
Well, John's had a great follow-up here. I'm going to go right, put it in the chat. Thank you, John, for showing that the chat works, by the way. Have you seen these rebrands fail or alienate existing audiences? And if so, how do you avoid that?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly happens. The easiest way to to tackle that is talk to them before you do the rebrand.
Mm-hmm.
And include some of them in that process. I think that's, that how close can you be? Like, if you want to know your audience, you have to talk to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And have conversations with them and at least feel them out. There may be a time and place to say, we don't care, right? The purpose is shifted so much that this audience that we've had in the past, we are no longer talking to. And so it doesn't matter. But I don't think that's common. That's very rare.
I've seen that happen with colleges or universities a couple of times who just have a completely different. They were a small Bible college and now they're a global research university or whatever they went. So they don't.
That's a good example. That's a really good example.
They don't care what their old alumni think, and however unfair that may sound. So I do think that happens, but I think your point's really well taken. Like in this case, we're talking about a nonprofit with John. I guess we'd be talking about including your donors, right? Mike, in the process.
Find some key donors, have conversations with them about this process you're about to embark on. Ask them what their feelings are about your identity, your purpose, your personality, your culture, your values, what resonates with them. As you're formulating new ones, ask for feedback, right? And that could be done through, I really like one-on-ones because you get kind of unfiltered, and sometimes it's helpful to have a third party do that for you. You almost get like the most unadulterated feedback.
Right.
Because a lot of times it's like, there's a relationship between you and the donor, and there's a certain level they're not going to be super transparent because they don't want to mess that up. They like you at some level, hopefully. And they don't want to ruin the relationship. It's so funny how many organizations where we've done that. We've done these interviews with their donors or with their clients on the for-profit side, and there's feedback we get that's like way outside the bounds of the branding aspects. It's like, I just want you to know that there's this account manager that we have, or that that is in the organization, and here's the problems we've had over the last year. And we're like, okay, I'll write that down. Do you want me to pass that along? That's not really the point of this exercise, but that should probably get fixed, you think? And a lot of times the organization, when we tell them that, and they go, we had no idea. We're like, because for the first time, somebody has asked them that they're willing to kind of be transparent with. So that does happen, although that's not the point of the exercise. But that actually is a tangential benefit, right? If you include some of your best donors that have strong relationships with, man, how much deeper are those relationships going to be when you're done?
Just like a capital campaign, that strikes me. It's a very similar principle. Feasibility study, draw people in, make them feel like they're part of the process, you care about their opinion, and hopefully that would avoid. Would you go beyond key donors, Mike? Let's say John, I have no idea, but thank you for asking these questions. So you're giving us like a real world thing to talk about. Let's say John has 10,000 donors. Would you go beyond this 50 key donors to somehow include them in the rebrand process? How would you do that?
I definitely would survey the full 10,000. Because you
just to make them feel like they had a voice in the process in a way, and also to learn some things.
I think to learn as well. Definitely, it has a relationship aspect to it, right? Like, hey, you had a voice, you had an opportunity, and you can do the same thing internally with your team. I would want to see some kind of, like, depending on how large you are, if you're a large organization, I would want to survey your team as part of that process, because it's going to make them feel like there's buy-in, right? And if you think about like who has to be bought into a rebrand, it must be your team. At least the like core leadership at the very least. And really, like, if you can get everybody bought in, you're going to have a successful rollout, right? Because these are the representatives of your brand on a day-to-day basis. But same thing with donors, hey, let's survey all 10,000, give them a sense of a voice, buy-in. I also would want to look for gut check kind of, hey, there might be some people in here who are a little more critical. And we're going to look for those. The
Right.
survey, I would be more focused on patterns. I would not be trying to pull out specific like answers. And I
Yeah.
would be looking for like, hey, if we're working on 5 new core values, let's put those core values in front of them and say on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you feel like this resonates with the experiences you've had with our organization. I would try to keep it a little bit more, it is still qualitative, but in a quantitative way that you're trying to measure that. Your one-on-ones, though, it's a great opportunity to ask a lot of follow-up questions and kind of like let that conversation go as far as it'll go, and just get as much feedback. Hey, does this resonate? Why does this not resonate? Are these the words that you would use? What other words would you use? And then ultimately, like, hey, this is the story we think we should be telling. Does that resonate with you? Because if they say it's not resonating, you got go back to the drawing board.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, it's like, if your donors aren't bought in, you're going to have a tough time. So
we may have already covered a little bit of this, but I'm going to give this question to you anyway. You can use Amphil as an example here. What are some of the organizations that you've worked with? What do they do wrong in building their brands? That's why you can use an example if you want. And what are the ramifications? Like, there's some wrong things we haven't covered yet.
Yeah. Not getting unique with all those elements. I think especially core values, that's the easy one to kind of like,
it's almost you pull them off the shelf. They're 20.
Or do a little bit of work and be like, well, this is what we believe. We believe in excellence. We believe in service. We believe in people. And it's like, you do. That's true, right? Like, you probably aren't saying those things unless you're just getting started and you're literally like making it up on the fly, right? But if you've been around a little while, it's like, yeah, you probably have a gut check on that. But the problem is that's in language and in terms that are really vague. They're large, they're not distinctive. And so the pattern that I like to approach that with is just, well, but why? Why people? Or why excellence? Tell me why. And then, the next answer. Okay, well, then tell me why about that. Until we get to an answer that's like, no one else on the planet can say that, right? And then let's put it in language that's actually really unique to your culture. Let's try to find words and key phrases and kind of maxims that you already use on a daily basis amongst your team or even with your donors, in words that are like unique to your culture and what you're doing. And obviously that's going to extrapolate out like, hey, can you make your logo unique? Can you make your visuals unique? Don't settle for like, well, everyone else is green, so let's be green too. That rarely happens. I think most people want to try to differentiate. I think the hardest part is there will come a point where like the obvious differentiator is a risk. And sometimes you just have to say, yeah, we're going to lean in and own it. I was thinking about this.
Safe with their brands generally. They're not risky enough.
Yeah, not risking enough. I think that's, and you'll find that not just nonprofits. It's like, man, so many industries, the aversion to risk within branding is really high. And the desire to not rock the boat too much, like, ooh, I don't know if people will accept that, or and it's like they'll accept a lot because what's required to accept it is not whether they like it or not, it's whether you own it, right? And so that's the other aspect I think where there's a lot of failure is an unwillingness to stick with those decisions long enough. You should be well bored and tired of your brand before you ever make a change to it. And that's something that I think is hard, especially on the kind of the more the communication side of organizations. A lot of creatives tend to fall into that. And that's what, their background is. And it's like, oh, we've been using these colors for a year now. Can't we change it? It's like, no, like your audience has barely seen them. Right. I think of an organization here locally that I think has done a really good job in that is Grand Canyon University. They own the color purple. Like it is everywhere. Is it the right color? I have no idea.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. But it does fit their tagline. It's like, find your purpose, right? There's this idea of passion and purpose, and the purple works really well with that. Certainly it's distinctive within the kind of landscape of universities here in Arizona. No one else is using that color. But you'll see it on every billboard. You'll see it all over their website, and they've been using it for years. I am sure the marketing department is like, I am sick of purple. So sick of it. Give me some other color I can start using. And the answer is no. Like the answer is just, sorry, this is our brand. This is who we are, and we have to own it. And that's the other aspect of like really good brands just own every asset, and they use it and use it and use it until like they're tired of it, knowing that the audience isn't seeing it as much as you are.
It's just
right?
now used to it.
They're just seeing it now.
Right.
So get over it.
That's good advice. You talk about truth, which is odd for a marketing person. Ha ha ha. Insert drum roll here.
Yeah.
Why is truth? You talked about this while we were doing our branding with you. Critical for like a brand, building a really good brand, a lasting, impactful brand.
Yeah. We're getting philosophical now.
Yeah, let's get.
And I think a lot of marketers would disagree with me on this, which is why we wrote our book. Because really we spent a lot of the book talking about why we believe the truth is there in brands, in identity, and why you have to build based on that truth and not just make stuff up. And that's because I think the alternative is fake, false, or forced, right? And when you really start to unpack what is a fake brand or fake kind of exterior to an organization, or a false one or a forced one, it's a lie, right? The alternative to the truth is a lie. And if that's how we're building our brands, one, that does no service to the people we're trying to help. It does no service to the donors that we want to be a part of what we're doing, right? We're building a relationship on day one based on a lie. It's also not going to stand the test of time. We live in a world where you cannot pull the wool over people's eyes for that long, right? Every donor can be connected to every donor, right? At the touch of a button. And there's no opportunity really to hide anything for very long. You can try. And if you want to try to do it, I think there's a lot of organizations that are really bought into like fake it till you make it type of mentality.
Yeah.
My response is always just, why not just make it based on who you are? And own who you are and be truthful from day one and not try to be something that you're not.
What is some way? Give me an example of what fake looks like or force looks like. Can you just
every MLM you've ever seen in your life?
What's that?
Every multi-level marketing brand. I mean, that's like that's the extreme example, right? Yeah. It's like nothing really exists. I'm not even sure this product exists.
Yeah.
And yet there's a brand behind it. And oftentimes it's a seemingly strong brand. It looks good. It's got compelling messaging, right? The marketing is there, but there's nothing real behind it. I don't find that that's, super common in the nonprofit world, unless you're talking about fraudulent nonprofits, right? Where someone's really trying to manipulate people.
Right.
But I think, a truly, well-meaning, well-intentioned organization, I think is more tempted into either forced or fake in the sense of borrowing, right?
Okay.
Trying to shortcut the process and say, let's take things that other organizations have done and do that with our brand. And I'm not an opponent to knowing your competitors. I think there's great insights that can be gained from knowing kind of who's in the landscape. And within nonprofits, it's not really like you have direct competitors, right? It's more that, hey, we're all jockeying for money, right? And every donor has a limited amount of money and a limited number of places they're going to put that money. And then the time that it takes to get their attention. And so you're always competing for attention at the very least. And so you want to kind of know what's in the marketplace. You want to kind of know what the landscape looks like, who your donors are already hearing from, the messaging that they're getting, what things are competing for their attention and their dollars. Know those things. But I don't think that means you go to those brands and you say, well, they're doing this with their brand. We should do that with our brand.
Interesting.
I think you can learn tactics and borrow those from a marketing perspective of like, where are they? How are they reaching people? But I would not be looking at them as like, this is an inspiration point for our brand. Because that's their organization with their own unique identity. There is a truth to that identity. Why would you try to build yours on theirs?
You have a very look within message, Mike.
Yes, it's very inside out. That is,
which is actually very liberating.
Our approach.
Hear it from you. It's like, oh, really? If I just pay attention to who I am or who we are and our history of what we're trying to accomplish, that there's something here. I think people often don't have enough confidence in themselves, maybe, or their own organizations.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's the temptation. Is it's like, well, we don't know, and so let's go look outside of ourselves to kind of find the answers to who we are. And that's just a matter of like someone saying, no, we need to take the time, put in the effort, and really understand ourselves. And depending on the size, obviously, that's going to be harder. The larger you are, the longer you've spent not really answering those questions as to what our purpose is and why do we exist and what is our unique culture and what do we really value in the world. Those answers are harder. The larger you get, the more you've kind of allowed a lot of things to happen, not just programs you've added in, but even just people you've put on the team. You're going to have voices in the room that maybe are not in alignment.
This is a good point. Hold on. Let's just stop on this for a second, because this is a sort of unexpected hidden benefits of being really clear about your brand. It seems to me, and going through the process you've been talking about clarifying and articulating rigorously what your core values are, what your personality is, your purpose. It should help you avoid hiring mistakes. Is that?
It should. It really should. If you're using it correctly. And you're using it in the hiring process, not just onboarding, but actually being very like overt about this is how we operate. This is what we believe in. This is what we really value.
Are oddly, sometimes oddly shy about doing that. Like it's illegal to share what your core values are with potential employees. Do you find that there's a kind of shy?
Oh yeah. And I think in our highly politicized world, there's like there's a temptation to kind of get sucked into like, oh, I don't want to get canceled because we have a strong viewpoint in a certain area. What I find though is that that's the opposite of what actually happens, right? Is that you end up producing such clarity on what you believe and what you stand for and what you're trying to achieve. People are attracted to that. The right people are attracted to that. And yes, it pushes some people away, but those were the people you never wanted in the first place.
That's okay.
Right. One of my business partners who co-wrote the book with me, we actually spent a podcast episode recently talking all about how like strong brands, I don't think can actually get canceled. Because when you're clear about what you stand for, when certain groups say, well, we're going to turn you off, right? We're not going to pay attention. We're going to make sure others don't pay attention to you. Well, you're really clear about who you are and what you stand for. And therefore people still pay attention to you. And we see this time and time again with brands that like people attempt to cancel, but who are really like strong on what they believe in. And it's like, they always come out stronger. Like they get more PR out of it.
I didn't notice that My Pillow guy now has My Coffee.
That's a reasonable example.
Yeah. I was like, oh, this guy's
an interesting guy, but
now he's branched out into coffee. Now I know that's an extreme example, obviously, but
I think of like Daily Wire. Daily Wire is an example for me that like stands really strongly in that they're just like, we're not going to apologize for who we are. You might not like it, and that's fine. And people try to shut them down all the time. And all that happens is they get bigger. And I'm just like, and I, it doesn't really matter what side of any political issue you're on. I think that holds true. That like your brand strength comes from having a very particular, strong viewpoint, and really holding to it and just saying, hey, we're not going to apologize for this is our viewpoint. And people are either pushed away or they're really attracted to it.
It's all well beyond, I think, what most people think about when they think about branding. They talk to us about color theory and how many words should be in a tagline. So
only three.
I hope that's what we got 3. They're long words though. I hope people are seeing there's way more to this. So let me ask you a question, and this is my next question, and I don't really have a good answer for this, Mike. I'm wondering if you will. How do I know whether I have a strong brand, or put that differently, how do I know whether I have a brand that's working for me or one that's not working, or how? The world you're in here seems like such a less tangible world.
It is.
Yeah. So how do I know?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of measures, right? It's not one singular measure. There's no like measureMyBrandNow.com or something like that.
Hey, you should first of all, no one can buy that URL. Mike just laid into it.
Hey, go get it. and these, I think sometimes the answers are like almost too obvious and we want it to be harder. NPS. It's not a foolproof measure, but Net Promoter Score is a great way to just measure at a basic level how people feel about your organization. Are they willing to promote you or not?
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And you can talk about how that measure has faults in it.
Mhm.
Great. Go add in another measure and build it out in the way that works for your organization. Same thing with an internal NPS or an ENPS. Like do that with your staff and say, hey, how willing are you to promote us?
I wonder from a nonprofit perspective whether that would be measurable in part by what percentage of your staff actually gives to the organization.
And then do a donor NPS, right?
Yeah.
And make it specific to donors and say, how willing are you to say, yes, I donated and I want you to donate too.
I don't know anybody in here in this, if you want to put in the chat, have you ever done a donor NPS? I would really be interested. I don't know, Mike, of anybody. Yeah, maybe I'm not working with the right nonprofits. I've worked with a couple of hundred myself in the last 14 years. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say those words. Like, you know, that's really interesting. It's surprising. So,
I mean, that's like, you kind of look at like, what are some of the like elements of the holy grail of brand, right? One is, are the people, your audience you're talking to, the people that you're involving in your mission, are they willing to refer you, right? Are they willing to talk about you? Are they willing to put the sticker on their bumper, on their bumper, right? Like, and that might not be the right place, but what is your version of that, right? Where they're saying, I'm going to wear these colors on my sleeve, right? And associate myself with your brand and say, I am a part of this. I want to be a part of it. I want others to know that I'm a part of it. You shouldn't expect that from everybody. That's foolhardy, right?
Right.
Even like somebody like Apple only expects like 10% of their market to be like the show. I'm an Apple person, right? Like I'm cutting edge. I buy every product as soon as it comes out. I'm avidly watching like the big, announcement every year about the new products and stuff. That's like 10% of their customer base. Everyone else is following, right? Yeah. So that's one measure. And then I'd also look at loyalty, right? So I'm looking at like average lifetime donor value, right?
Donor retention rate.
Is that growing, right? I'm also looking at churn. So I'm looking at like how quickly are we churning out donors? And then there's some more like less metric driven stuff of just like, let's look at the efficiency of our communications and marketing programs. They should become more efficient with strong branding, right? Because the messaging, you're not wrangling about messaging every time you put a new campaign together. It's like at the top level, organizational level, we know what we're saying. We're not straying from that. We're not making it up every new time. And so it should reduce the friction and the amount of work that you're having to put in on campaign to campaign level. You should also be raising more amounts of donors based on the same amount of spend to get in front of them. Those are some of the metrics that I would be looking for and saying, okay, let's put a combination of these together, and it's going to take time. I don't expect that to happen like day 3. Oh, we rebranded and day 3 no, it's probably going to take a couple of years.
Right.
And there's some consistency required. Again, think back, like great brands not just have great assets, they use them very consistently over time, over and over and over. And they know that it's kind of this like, it's just being disciplined with your brand and just saying, hey, we know it's right, and we just got to stick with it. And we know that over time we're going to get there. And you kind of hit that critical mass at some point, hopefully, where it starts to kind of bleed out. And you think about like some nonprofits I think of that have maybe reached somewhat of I wouldn't say a total epitome, because I think every brand has flaws, right? At some level. But I think of like Live Strong and their yellow bracelets.
Yeah.
Or I think of, Breast Cancer Awareness Society and the pink ribbon, where they have assets in their branding that are now like almost universally adopted, almost to the point where you kind of forget about the organization that started them, which maybe is where there's a little bit of a flaw there. But you think about like, man, these are causes, right? That people are rallying around, and they have a very specific asset, this artifact that is like just intrinsic. It's become like kind of generic to that cause. Even though one organization had kind of the vision to say, this is the thing we're going to put that and build that equity around.
Right.
And I would say that's probably another measure you can look at. And it's not a very quantitative measure, but like, are people gravitating to our cause who don't even totally know who we are? Right. But they're using assets that we've created. And we're building awareness around something even bigger than ourselves, and it's gaining momentum, and people are kind of latching onto that and saying, I want to be a part of that too. Yeah. So
That's
I
good.
think those are kind of interesting examples of
Yeah.
like where you could get to with your brand.
Yeah.
Like that Live Strong idea or the pink ribbon.
Yeah. I mean, those are holy grail type moments.
Yep.
It's hard but I think the point's well taken. I would say if your brand, like, I don't know how you measure this, but we always talk about how you're trying to achieve with your donors a sense of identity and belongingness on their side, right? That they identify with and feel like they belong to in some important way. The community that centers around your organization. Is your brand helping that happen? Is it hindering it? And I think all the measures you already just pointed out would be ways to quantify that. But let's say, as we cover getting close to the end of our time here, if you have any other questions, let us know in the chat or the Q&A. So let's say I have a pretty good sense, Mike. Well, there could be two different situations. I'll give you both, and you can answer. It might be the same answer. One is like, hey, our organization's grown fast. We started 10 years ago. Now we're at $5 million, $3 million, whatever. We're kind of that next step is coming now. Next step of professionalization. And then there's another situation where I feel like our brand isn't working for us. Our donor retention rate isn't where we want it to be. We're actually not getting more donors. It just seems tired. Each of these organizations is like, we're ready for a rebrand. How long does that take? Like, what should I budget, generally speaking, in a range in terms of time and resources? Because like people, I think sometimes maybe think it's $500,000. They may think it's $5,000.
No, it's a huge variety of expectation. And every organization kind of has a little different appetite. My general rule of thumb is take your total overall like finances in a particular year, the money in 1 to 3%. That's probably about where a good rebrand is going to work out. You know, and so
if you're a $5 million nonprofit, just to be clear, everybody, 50 to 150K.
And you know, you're gonna have a different appetite depending on kind of how your organization is structured. And but yeah, I think that's a safe number. You might be able to get it for a little bit less. I doubt you'd be hitting more than that. I'd be.
You shouldn't
really,
try.
You shouldn't. I wouldn't.
I think if you're doing a rebrand here, you know, it's not something you do every year. So
the other things to take into account in terms of like expense and time that's required.
Right.
How large is your organization? Right. So the larger you are, the more decision makers you have in the process, the longer it's going to take and the more money it's going to cost. Because you're having to rally more people around it and get their input, get their feedback.
Change management here is significant.
Yes. And that will extend the timeline. You know, we did basically a reboot of a nonprofit here locally 4 years ago. One decision maker. I sat with him for 2 hours. We talked through what they needed. One single logo design, no rounds of revisions. Off to the races building the website. The website went really fast. I think within 4 to 6 weeks we were done. Right. That's probably the absolute fastest I've ever seen it happen. And that's with the unique aspect of someone who's a single decision maker who, if you're into disc profiles, is a high D on the disc profile, like 100, right? Who's just like, just go. I don't want to spend time on this stuff. And he trusted us that we were going to do a good job.
I know the time.
Versus, you know, you get, 20 people on a board who all feel like they have to have a say. Oh my goodness. In the board level, when you get into like, okay, there's executive leadership on the team and there's board members who need to probably be involved. That is really going to slow it down. You're going to need to take your time, involve them, and really the more you can set some ground rules up front and say, here is who is going to be involved and needs to be involved and wants to be involved on day one, the better chance you have of something getting done a little bit faster. But every organization is different, and there's a different appetite for change. There's a different appetite for how involved they want to be in that. That's something you need to gauge. Do you have a culture where people are like, I really want to be involved in every minute detail of this rebrand?
Yeah.
Plan for that, and maybe consider a process where you kind of own more of that process internally.
Yeah.
I know the question always comes up, like, do I need an outside agency or consultant? I'm certainly biased, right? Like, full disclosure,
Well, look, I'll speak for you because like I'm not, but I hired you to do it for us. And I can't imagine, it's just like direct mail. Like, why would you do this in-house? Or a feasibility study for a capital campaign where like, you're just not going to get as good information if you do it in-house. So to me, I think I can answer this in a fairly unbiased way, Mike, like in Resound or somebody else. Like if you're
just get somebody.
You need a fresh set of eyes. You can't, your marketing person may be fantastic, but they don't have a fresh set of eyes. Most likely. So to me, and plus there's a kind of, you're going to bring your board, your leadership might listen a little bit more to the outside person when they say the exact same thing that your in-house people have been saying, just because they're not, can't be dismissed for whatever reason. So
one of my favorite quotes from kind of a long-standing brand specialist strategist is Michael Beirut. He's one of the senior partners at Pentagram, which is known as one of the top branding agencies in the world. I mean, they've worked with some of the biggest Fortune 500 companies. And he has stated in the past that, he's like 10% of why clients hire us is the actual branding, and 90% is to help them navigate their own internal politics. And I think there's some truth to like a third party, especially if they've been around the block and they've done some branding, they've worked with boards, they've taken organizations through this process before, and they have a good process for it. It's going to help you make sure that this gets owned, right? That everyone feels like I had a place to give my input. I had my voice heard. I was a part of this process,
right?
And to keep it moving. I think there's so many opportunities for it to stall.
Sure.
And we've seen that. Certainly, like, we're not perfect. We've had times in the past where, we've had clients where it's like, man, we missed that one. We should have done it differently. I have one example of a client that we worked with who's a senior partner. I was working through the marketing director of the firm, and a senior partner went behind her back and tried to have their in-house designer, who was like 1 year out of school, design the new logo. And, we got it back on track, but man, there was a lot of soul searching in that process for both us and the marketing director. She's like, how did I let this happen? Right. Like, why is he going around me? Why is he not talking to me? And clearly, like, there's a trust issue here we got to work through. And so it's just like those kinds of things where like, she's calling me up and saying, here's what happened. And I'm like, oh man, okay, we need to put some process in place. We need to have a little heart to heart, and get this, back on track. And sometimes a third party can be really helpful in that. Someone that, a board or other leadership will listen to and say, okay, well, they've been around the block. They've done this before, especially if you have no one in-house who's really taking you through that process.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Well, we are at time, or just about at time. So we'll let it go there. So Mike Jones, the CEO of Resound. You can find him at resoundcreative.com. Also the author of You Are Remarkable, How to Unlock Your Authentic Brand. You can find that everywhere, I assume. Right, Mike?
Amazon's the easy place. Yep.
Okay, but try not to buy from Amazon. Don't
hit me up. Send me an email and I'll get you a copy.
Well, you buy alibris.com. That's my Amazon alternative for everybody.
There you go.
alibris.com. ALIBRIS. I don't own stock in alibris. That's where I get my books now. Mike, thanks so much for doing this. Appreciate it. Great insights. Very smart. Highly recommend Mike and his team Resound if you're in this market, or just want to recommend them to anybody else. So thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. I appreciate it.